Hey everyone, I'm Fluffy. Welcome back to Fluffy Talks Tabletop. Today we're going to talk about building your own setting to play in, and this is a big deal because this changes your immersion for your PCs. It's very difficult to build a fully immersive world. So we're going to talk about some of the things that you can do to make a very immersive world for your PCs to play in, because that's part of what makes role-playing fun. So the first thing you need to do is determine what kind of setting do you want to play in. Do you want this to be standard high fantasy, a modern day setting, sci-fi, Wild West, 1800s, things like that? And keep that setting in mind for the entirety of your construction, especially if you want to introduce anachronisms that go outside of your standard time period. For example, 1800s but with cell phones or something like that. I personally don't like pre-built settings, and I'll explain why later, but if you are picking something outside of a standard fantasy setting, you may want to look into alternate games to run instead of just D&D, because a lot of times, stats for D&D are built for a specific system and with specific things in mind, and going outside of that can be complicated. There's a famous example of this in, I believe it's the classic 3.5 Dungeon Master's Guide. There are stats for an antimatter rifle, and it's a bit ridiculous. So if you're looking for a dystopian modern era, and when I say dystopian, I don't mean 1984 or whatever like that. I mean dystopian is the word that I'm looking for, but I'm having trouble explaining it, so I'll just go on. You may want to look at World of Darkness, which my personal favorite setting. If you're looking into a sci-fi or something like that, I would look into Starfinder, the new Pathfinder expansion, as it's pretty interesting. I haven't gotten a chance to sit down and read the whole thing, which is why there's no video on it, so keep updated for that. Modern settings are relatively easy. There's a lot of games that take place in modern settings, and I can sit here and hype up World of Darkness all I want, but there are other settings that run modern day very well. D20 Modern, for example, I got to play in a D20 Modern game not that long ago. D20 Modern is a lot of fun, and despite the fact that it doesn't fix a lot of the things that Dungeons & Dragons had wrong with it, it's definitely a fully playable system. So D20 Modern is always a good choice. For a while I looked into running a steampunk style game, and I actually found a system that I wanted to use called Tephra, that was I knew about Tephra because Clara, a girl that I used to live with, that we were dating at the time, also wanted to run a steampunk game, and she actually settled on Tephra for hers. So that's how I knew about Tephra. The only thing about Tephra is that Tephra has a magic system built in, so if you want to run a no magic campaign, you're going to have to write that out. So, don't be afraid to make modifications to your settings and things like that, or your systems, rather, to fit your setting. I have completely destroyed Open D10 or D10 system for World of Darkness for the purpose of building all sorts of new systems for new settings and things like that. So we'll start with fantasy settings. Obviously, Dungeons and Dragons is a big one, but there are hundreds and hundreds of fantasy settings. It would take more than this video to name them all. The different types of settings that you can, or the different type of worlds, I guess, you can work from in here are pre-built, which I don't like pre-built. I mentioned this earlier. What I don't like about pre-built is I don't like it when other players know more about a setting than I do. Trying to explain, you know, who the king of Ravenholm or something like that is, and someone's like, well, actually, Ravenholm has a queen. They've been a matriarchal society for hundreds of years. That might mess with your entire setting. That one not specifically, but if there's like, and you guys go in to fight a dragon. Well, there aren't actually dragons on this continent. They were run off by such and such NPC 600 years ago, and they never came back. That can get a tiny little bit aggravating, and it can really mess with encounters and things like that. So if you're going to do pre-built, make sure you do a ton of research. I actually don't suggest pre-built settings for people who are just getting into being a game master, but you know, that's my own personal preference. I would rather build my own world than play in someone else's. You can also do modified settings. Some friends of mine have had really good success with modified settings where they build they kind of customize like Pathfinder Standard or World of Darkness Standard or something like that, and they end up with their own custom setting that is heavily modified or lightly modified from the original. And then there's, of course, entirely homebrew. This one is my personal favorite, and I find it makes my life a little easier. For modern settings, in addition to modifying the core setting, using a core setting, or something like that, you also have a couple other options. You have alternate reality, which the game kind of already is, but you could set, for example, World of Darkness, you could run that game in pretty much any town or city in the United States. For the most part, I say in the United States, really what I should have said was anywhere in the world. Sorry about that. You could, of course, build an entirely custom setting that might not even take place on Earth. It could take place anywhere. But another one that I have a lot of success with is what I like to call insular fictional settings, which is a made-up town or a made-up city somewhere in the real world. Famous example of this for me in my settings is the city of Wessington, which is located somewhere on the East Coast. Never really nailed down exactly where, but it gives me a pretty good idea of like what the weather patterns would be like. And Wessington is an entirely fictional city that is walled off and designed to be a safe haven for vampires due to the spread of a nasty disease. That one is actually one of my more favorite settings, but I've never really had a chance to run a full game for it. I've run a couple one-shots, but never a full setting. Sci-fi kind of runs the same way. You can run alternate reality, which is essentially core setting. Depending on what setting you're running, or what system you're running, it may have different core settings. You could build an entirely custom universe. Be warned, this may take you a little bit of time. Or you can just do the insular fictional settings again and have custom places in the real universe. So you could have a colony on Mars, which would be kind of alternate reality, because it does take place in the real world. Or you could just make up planets and play on those. That's perfectly fine. It's your setting, do whatever you want. When it comes to actually building the settings, there's two kind of ways to go, in my opinion. And again, this is entirely my opinion, so hear me out on this. There is inside out and outside in. I tend to start with inside out unless I have a lot of time, and then I do outside in. So the way that inside out works is you start by building like the town that the PCs are going to be in or near, and kind of expand into building your world from that. And I like this because it gives you kind of a good idea of what the PCs are going to see and interact with, and what their choices are going to be before you start making huge world decisions. Whereas outside in is more along the lines of designing an entire world and then starting to centralize it on the PCs as they move about. So in that one, you might build an entire continent with different large cities and different religions and different peoples and things like that, but not start designing towns until the PCs start getting to them. And this is nice because it gives you a foundation to work on for your individual towns. But if there's an aspect of the world that is important to you, but that the PCs are kind of ignoring, for example, you have an entire continent that spans 3 or 4 different major religions that cause a little bit of tension, but not enough to cause wars. But none of your PCs are clerics and don't follow any of these religions and don't care, then you've spent all this time constructing and designing something for your world that the PCs really don't care about. And that sucks when that happens, but, you know, a lot of times you'll build stuff and the PCs won't even take notice or don't care. I have built entire dungeons that the PCs took one look at from the outside and said, we're not going in there, that looks terrifying. Or they've found another thing to do. So the next thing on my list to talk about is themes and symbolism in construction. This is a very important thing to keep in mind. In addition to like mechanic things, like does this town have access to magic readily? Do they use torches to light their walls, or do they use magic lights? You know, do they have that kind of access? And this might be different town to town, or city to city, or area to area, but there are little symbolic things that you can put in your construction that sometimes you have to build outside in for. For example, in the Brandon Sanderson Stormlight Archive books, there's a power called soul casting, which is the ability to turn most materials into other materials. That power is more complicated than that, but we're not going to go into it. So things like metal railings for balconies, they're not forged, they're not cast, they are made out of wood and rope and soul cast into metal. But soul casting is expensive, and normally only like the powerful people in the world have, not all of them, but like the upper class has access to that. So like for like a war zone area, you might see the highborn people, they have soul cast stone barracks and things like that that go up immediately, that give them a good tactical advantage. But the the people that don't have access to that, they have to build them out of wood or something like that. While we're on that note, any weird weather phenomenon or anything like that can really affect the way that you build your stuff. In the Stormlight Archive, there is a massive storm called a high storm that comes through at a relatively predictable rate, but is incredibly damaging. So everything is built kind of hiding from the high storm. They're built into the leeward side of cliffs, or they're built with like the storm side walls stronger, because it always comes from the same direction and always moves in the same way. So this is a very predictable weather phenomenon, and the world is built around that. You don't see it as much in another Brandon Sanderson novel series, the Mistborn series, but at night there's a phenomenon in that series called the mists, which is a dense fog that kind of coalesces out of the air at night, and the people are scared of it. They don't go out in it. Now, the mist specifically doesn't enter buildings. If it like pours in through a door, it evaporates very quickly. But imagine a scenario in which that wasn't a thing, where the mists were a terrifying thing that didn't fade away when they came inside. You might build buildings without windows. You might build buildings so that, like, with doors designed to, like, airlock so that the mists can't get inside. This is the kind of stuff you got to look into when you have strange weather or geological phenomenon or things like that. If you have a city that has a lot of earthquakes, they probably have very stable buildings. And it's not a huge thing, but the PCs might notice, hey, this town exists like right near a volcano and has a ton of earthquakes all the time, but all the buildings are rickety wooden shacks. How does that work? And that kind of breaks immersion. And another thing for that is the actual symbolism. Right now, in one of my World of Darkness games, my Tuesday night game, my characters are currently in they're on a different planescape. Well, they're on a different plane. And that plane is kind of burnt out. It used to have a bunch of magic, and now it doesn't. The magic kind of burnt away. And to kind of symbolize that, a lot of the buildings they're made of stone, and there's not a lot of wood or anything like that, and they have these really like tall architectures and things like that with large rooms, and it kind of gives the whole place a skeletal feel. And the NPCs that live there, they mostly wear grayscale colors. They don't like bright colors. It's just not a thing. Mostly because it's not really common in their world, but this gives the area this really like bleached out skeletal look. And when the PCs first showed up, they're all in relatively bright colors comparatively, and they're very easy to spot. So they're almost immediately recognized as outsiders. And that kind of color symbolism gives them a good idea of what the world really feels like. It gives a really cool bleakness to the world that is exactly what I was going for. Now, building worlds and places for the characters to go, and beautiful mountain ranges and things like that is all well and good, but people have to live there. And this is the tough one. We'll take Pathfinder, for example. Does the city that they're living in have magic access? Are there a lot of sorcerers? Are there a lot of wizards? Things like that. Are sorcerers seen in a negative light because they didn't study for their powers? Are wizards seen in a negative light because they are weaker? Is there a lot of crime? Is there no crime? What culture does the area have? When I ported Rokugan from L5R to Pathfinder, one of the things that I brought with it was the idea of an honorable duel. So the characters were able to experience occasionally duels between other NPCs, or even dueling another NPC themselves. And that idea of the honorable duel, especially with bets placed on it, was a thing that they looked into occasionally to see how a city was going. If the city had honorable duels relatively often, then the city had powerful warriors, at least for the area, in it that were confident enough that they were okay to duel and, lose hit points and be injured because the place wasn't at war and was safe. So in an area that's not safe, you wouldn't see that. And that gives a really cool indication of what a city is like just from a single mechanic. And there's a lot of stuff that you can do for this kind of building that gives you these really, really gorgeous living cities. I always like to include some random little information or fact about a city or area for the PCs that's different from where they were to give the city its own kind of feel. In one city in my industry standard Pathfinder game, or basic Pathfinder game, there's an entire area where trade in living dragonoids is illegal. You cannot buy or sell living dragons, drakes, pseudo-dragons of any kind. And this actually came into play because there was a character who had a pseudo-dragon familiar, so he had to actually hide his familiar for the entire time because that was illegal there. So just the little nuances like that. You know, is the city run by a council? Is it a city-state run by a king? Who is its ruling body? Is the city really run by that ruling body, or is that ruling body being manipulated by another group? You know, let's say it's run by a council, but that council is mostly under the influence of a large group, not large, but a group of wealthy merchants who actually run the town. In that case, you might see more laws regarding trade than you would regarding crime, except, you know, they'd probably see theft of goods pretty, you know, they'd probably be pretty hard on that. So trying to decide how you want your town or city or area to function has a lot to do with the people that live there and the people that run the place. You know, is this place run by a king? If so, does the king live there? Does he live really far away? Is this a small area? Maybe it's a big city that used to be its own city-state. It was run by its own leader. And then, you know, years and years later, maybe even decades later, there was a revolution in the immediate, not immediate, but in the area, and now the area is ruled by a faraway king who rules a bunch of different areas. So now you might see, like, maybe the area was a big port trade town, but because the king has other bigger port trade towns, this is now the smallest port town in the kingdom and doesn't see a lot of import-export of goods. This is all stuff that, you know, might never come up, but it's important to know if the PCs need to buy a boat or something like that. So try and stick to at least one thing that is overarching and maybe random, like the no sale or trade or ownership of living dragonoids, but try and focus your world building and your setting construction on specifically what the PCs will experience, because it's no fun to sit there and figure out, you know, how is this city in trading with other cities, other countries, things like that, only to have the PCs never ever get involved in it. So try not to get carried away like I just did, and build a ton of stuff that the PCs will never ever bother with. But a good outline for building a town or a city or any kind of settlement is who runs the settlement, who really runs the settlement. You know, are they in the area or not? How much influence do specific parties have? What changes does that make? And what influences does that have on the city? What resources does the city have that are, you know, easy or common or very local? Is there anything that the city has specifically to itself? Is it right by an iron mine? Does it have a big like trade in grain? Things like that. These sound like little things, but they are a little bit important. If your city is by an iron mine, maybe they make very fine weapons here. Maybe the PCs, if they can raise a little bit of money, can buy upgraded equipment. Especially if you saw my my homebrew video and I was talking about non-magical enhancement bonuses. Maybe this place has good iron that functions like +1 or +2 magical weapons. Or maybe it's a special metal that stays hot once it's been forged. You know, you heat it up, it forges to shape, and then it cools down to the point where it's no longer really forgeable, but still hot. Maybe it deals 1d6 points of fire damage because of that. Or maybe it acts as if it's fire damage for the purposes of overcoming DR, but doesn't deal additional damage. You know, does the city grow a lot of cereal crops? If so, this might be an area to stock up on rations for your characters. If they're going out on a long trip, that might be a fantastic place to pick up some like dried breads and things like that that won't spoil on the trip. Is it a port city? Do the characters need to take a boat somewhere? You know, try and make it relevant, and you know, work from what you've got. There's a lot of little tiny unique things. Wessington, my World of Darkness city, is unique because it is a safe haven. There's a disease affecting vampires throughout the world called the whiting. And what the whiting does is it slowly drains your humanity stat. Once your humanity reaches 0, in this game, you become a kind of mindless monster or beast that just like kills and eats people. Vampires in the world are relatively uncommon, so most of it's written off as wild animal attacks or a crazy person or something like that. But here in the city of Wessington, a lot of vampires have moved in to make a safe haven. And because of that, there's a lot of underground security for vampires coming in or out. You need medical testing. You have to be you know, checked out to make sure that you don't carry the disease. And because of that, they can't. You know, it's only vampire to vampire transmission for the most part. Usually from like a scratch or a bite or something like that. So it kind of runs like the zombie virus. But humans have to check out incoming vampires to make sure they don't carry the disease. Now you've got humans that are technically breaking the masquerade. There are humans that know about vampires, and you know, that could be a thing. You know, are they planning to overthrow the vampires? Are they comfortable with where they live? The vampires provide well for them. This is the kind of stuff you really have to think about for your setting, because it's possible to get in way too deep before you notice some inconsistency that doesn't make any sense. When I was originally designing the city of Wessington, I had it so that vampires checked out other vampires when they were coming in, but then I realized that if that were the case, it would be possible to have transmission from an infected vampire to an uninfected vampire inside the city. And so I had to move the testing stations, or the medical stations, outside the city, and I had to staff them with humans. So sometimes you have to, you know, play test stuff, or you know, like run virtual simulation in your head, or talk it over with friends and things like that. There's a lot of things that you can accidentally write in that can just completely get out of hand. And sometimes it's the little things. There's a fantastic story here, but I can't tell it because it's not my story. If I get the opportunity to, I will. I will have. I will have the person who that story belongs to come on the channel and tell the story of the Meeper ducks. So remind me of that later. The last thing to do once you have kind of your general civilization, like what people are or what the PCs are going to experience when they get there and stuff like that, is making sure that you can stay on top of PC encounters. How many NPC encounters does a PC have every time they go into a city? You know, is it 2 or 3? Is it 15 to 20? Are you prepared to, on the fly, create 15 to 20 NPCs depending on where they're going? I like to keep a couple of lists of names handy based on race and things like that. And then when a PC runs into an NPC, I can give a name and then on the fly come up with a general description, and then I can write that down, and that NPC is saved for later. I also keep a set of general stats handy in the event that PCs start trouble, because there's always that one. And you never know when, you know, a casual talk with a shopkeeper is going to turn into a, you know, weapons drawn, magic out, full-on fight. And it has happened before. I have had PCs decide that they want to steal from an NPC that was rude to them, or, you know, something along those lines. And I have to come up with stats really, really fast. So usually what I do is I keep whatever the character's level is, I try and keep that level 3 levels up and 3 levels down for a total of 7 total levels, in general, to try and figure out what the PCs could deal with. If it's a very weak character, then, you know, I might roll it at the absolute lowest and nerf it down even more. If it's something that I don't want them to be able to deal with, I might look up stats specifically for it. But having the resource to build stats like that as quickly as possible is crucial for NPC encounters, especially when you're outside of a town. I was playing a character that was an ex-bounty hunter in a Pathfinder game, and he ran into one of his old bounty hunter friends, and it turned into a fight. And we had to take a 10 or 15 minute break while the dungeon master fleshed out the NPC for us to be able to fight. So being able to, on the fly, create those stats is very, very important. The other thing to really think about is weather and ecology. What kind of weather does the area have? Does it rain all the time? Is it mostly dry? Are they out in a desert? Things like that. And I'm bringing both of these up at the same time because it changes what the PCs are going to see in the area when it comes to, I'm going to say monster encounters, but if you're running World of Darkness, then that's not really a thing. But specifically for Dungeons and Dragons, knowing what monsters may live in the area will change the ecology a lot. If the PCs are out in the desert, they should probably know to keep their eyes open for blue dragons. But there are other lesser-known desert creatures that they might be unaware of. So knowing what you can put in the area that makes sense is important. You don't see red dragons on icy mountain slopes, for the most part, unless you can come up with a really good reason why it's there. Which brings me to the last thing that I want to talk about, and that is weird, anachronistic things, especially inside settings. Building unique encounters is important because if the PCs are always doing the same thing all the time, they might get bored. So having the ability to throw monsters outside of their standard ecology is an important thing. For example, icy mountain slopes. They're going through the mountains. They've seen all of the standard cold climate monsters, but as it turns out, maybe one of those is a dormant volcano, and suddenly they have to deal with, like, a fire dragon or some kind of burrowing worm that lives in lava, and they're popping up out of the ground in the immediate area. This is an encounter that the PCs are totally unprepared for, and could be a serious issue if they're all geared up to fight ice monsters, all their stuff deals fire damage, and they only prepared fire spells. So, knowing that, be careful throwing those monsters, because if they're prepped for one thing and they're not prepped for what you're about to throw at them, yeah, fun encounter, unless everybody dies. So, kind of keep in mind things like local weather, local ecology, local animals, who rules a city, what trades do they have, what important cultural significances do they have, if there's a specific religion that they follow, that's important. Where is the city located? Is it built into the side of a mountain? Stuff like that. Knowing all of these things can help you build an immersive world for the PCs to play in, and having that immersion can make them more apt to think in character and kind of stay away from the meta, which I hate metagaming, so, that's a thing that I like. I really enjoy building an immersive world for PCs to play in, where it's not just the old fantasy kick down the door and things like that. I like for my cities to have culture. I like for there to be local religions and pantheons and things like that. Having that kind of unique culture specific to a place is also good for the PCs, because if they can't remember the name of the place, they can be like, oh, that's the place where all the women keep one hand covered as it's part of their culture, or that's the place where all the men, regardless of what they do, they always carry a side sword because it's dangerous, and things like that. And those little things, they all link together to form this web, or this blanket that covers the world in immersion. And having all of those little connections can help PCs come to natural conclusions instead of having to ask you stuff. If the city requires that everyone, regardless, over the age of 12, regardless of their occupation, carry a sword, instead of the Dungeon Master saying, this area is dangerous, monsters attack occasionally, by having that visual indicator there, the PCs can organically come to that question of, why does everyone carry a sword? And instead of asking the Dungeon Master, they could ask an NPC, like, why do you wear a sword? We have to. Why do you have to? Because we live in the bottom of a valley, and occasionally, these awful monsters come down out of the trees that eat people, and we have to be able to defend ourselves. Or, like, the wall guard all carry silver longswords. Maybe there's werewolves in the woods. Things like that can build an immersive world very quickly and very easily, and I know it sounds weird to focus on the little things, but they are the most important. Because everything is kind of a little thing. And the more you can make the game immersive, and the more detail you can provide, the more your PCs can organically come to decisions, conclusions, and observations based on what they see and hear and feel and experience with their characters' senses, instead of just having to ask the Dungeon Master. So that's kind of my big rant on setting creation, and really the big thing here is take your time, talk with some other people, and try and make it as immersive as possible. It makes for a better setting than just, this is your standard fantasy town, there's nothing special about it. Well, why? Why is there nothing special about it? More importantly, if there's nothing special about it, why are the PCs even here? You know, I always heard for writing stories, is this the most interesting time in this character's life? And if not, why are you not talking about that? Why would the PCs go to somewhere entirely uninteresting with nothing to do? If there's nothing to do, then they shouldn't be there. If they are there for a specific reason, does that reason have any impact on the local area? Maybe they need to see a powerful wizard. Did he move to that location to get away from other magic users, to stop them from stealing his works? So the area is low magic. Maybe the area has a ton of magic, and that completely changes the way that the city looks. It's these little tiny things that flesh out beautiful scenarios and settings and things like that. It also lets the PCs come to things that you might not have even thought of. For example, a dungeon... I say dungeon, let's say it's the ruins of like an ancient temple. That's pretty neat, but what if it's in the bottom of this big, like sunken area in the ground? Maybe it was underwater. Maybe it used to be a lake and the lake drained. Maybe there was a massive earthquake and the lake drained away. Maybe that's why it wasn't preserved. Because it was preserved underneath the lake, and then it was, you know, damaged by the earthquake. So the only damage there is water damage and the earthquakes. And that could even change what you see inside the dungeon. Again, I say dungeon. We're calling it a temple this time. This is the kind of stuff that I love to do. I love to build these beautiful settings and things like that for people to experience. And they're not always beautiful. Sometimes they're horrible. Sometimes they're horrific and nightmarish. And sometimes they're bland with a little tiny bit of intrigue, and that makes them interesting. Like a city that is completely a normal fantasy city like you would see in any standard Dungeons & Dragons campaign, except that for some reason they all use, like, standing lamps. And instead of light bulbs, there's this strange glowing orb that they keep inside of them. Where did those come from? What do they do? Why are they there? That makes for fun things for the PCs to do and figure out while they're in cities. It's not just about dungeon crawling. Thank you guys for listening to me rant about setting building and setting construction and things like that. And I know I've been very repetitive this video, so I apologize for that. But if you have any questions about anything like that, please let me know in the comments. I'll try and answer questions as much as I can. If I need to do another video on this, because there's a bunch of questions that you guys have, I will do another video. And again, if you have something that you want to see on the channel, please let me know in the comments and I can see what I can make. Next video coming up is probably going to be how to be, like, what to do for your first time running a session, how to be a game master. So any input that you guys have on that, now's your chance to get in on it, and we will see you relatively soon. I'm trying to schedule a weekly stream. I was originally going to do Wednesdays, but I don't think I can do Wednesdays because Wednesdays have to be kind of late at night. So we may shift this to Fridays, and we may have a Friday night stream session. So hopefully we'll see people there, and you guys have a great night.